And so was born one of the world's wonders of military engineering.
In the early 20th century, naval supremacy was measured by the weight of steel and the roar of massive cannons. The weapon that would eventually replace these floating fortresses began its life as a slow, soot-caked ship hauling fuel to the very fleet it would one day displace. Before we look at how a coal ship transformed naval warfare, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to The Explainer for more deep dives into military history and engineering. Guided by the strategic doctrines of Alfred Thayer Mahan, admirals viewed the ocean as an arena for giant fleet actions. Success meant building thicker armor plate and larger naval rifles capable of exchanging high-explosive shells across 20 miles of open water. Aviation was barely an afterthought. In 1910 and 1911, a civilian pilot named Eugene Ely managed to launch and land a fragile contraption of wood and canvas on temporary wooden platforms built over the decks of cruisers. Conservative naval leadership looked at Ely's flights and saw a dangerous stunt, not a military tactic. Early airplanes were restricted to seaplanes that had to be hoisted by cranes, leaving the battleship at the top of the naval hierarchy. The outbreak of World War I shifted the geography of naval combat. Instead of massive ships lining up on the horizon, fleets faced unseen threats like naval mines and German U-boats lurking below the surface. Surviving these submerged hazards required constant coastal and ocean reconnaissance. Fleets suddenly needed eyes in the sky to spot submarines before they could strike. The British Royal Navy reacted quickly to this problem. They converted existing battlecruisers to host aircraft and commissioned HMS Argus, the world's first flat-deck aircraft carrier. Observing this from across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy leadership realized they were falling behind. Projecting power across two oceans now required a dedicated floating airfield, and they had exactly zero. Building a new class of warship from the keel up takes years. Desperate to catch up, the Navy bypassed traditional shipbuilding timelines and searched their existing fleet for a hull they could immediately repurpose. Their choice was the USS Jupiter. Commissioned in 1913, the Jupiter was a slow 542-foot Collier built for the unglamorous task of replenishing coal for dreadnoughts. With the fleet transitioning to oil power, the ship was essentially obsolete. But beneath its industrial exterior, the Jupiter served as a testbed for a revolutionary turbo-electric propulsion system. The electric drive provided precise speed control, maintaining a steady pace to generate consistent artificial wind down the flight deck. Furthermore, its cavernous coal holds were perfectly sized to be converted into protected aircraft hangars and fuel storage. The Navy's path to modern air warfare relied entirely on the gritty, industrial architecture of a retired coal delivery ship. On March 24, 1920, the Navy officially decommissioned the Jupiter at the Norfolk Navy Yard to begin a radical conversion project. Shipyard workers began by cutting away the vessel's original purpose. They stripped the heavy coal cranes, rigging, and coaling gantries that dominated the upper hull. In their place, structural engineers erected a forest of tall steel girders. These pillars supported a continuous wooden flight deck running 523 feet long and 64 feet wide, giving the vessel a strange top-heavy profile. Sailors took one look at the flat wooden platform perched high atop the dark hull and immediately nicknamed the ship the Covered Wagon. Building a runway on a ship created immediate physical problems. Standard vertical smokestacks would spew hot exhaust and smoke directly across the flight deck, blinding pilots during their final approach. Engineers solved this by designing a hinged funnel on the port side. During flight operations, the exhaust stack could physically rotate downward, venting the smoke away from the deck and down toward the water. To bridge the gap between the runway and the former coal holds below, they installed an electric aircraft elevator, allowing crews to lift planes straight up from the belly of the ship. Then came the physics of landing. To stop an airplane hitting a moving wooden deck at 50 miles per hour, they developed a system of transverse arresting wires, using friction and suspended sandbags to safely catch the plane's hook. These improvised mechanical solutions, from the elevators to the arresting cables, established the engineering framework that remains in use on today's nuclear supercarriers. 2 years after entering the dry dock, the conversion was complete. On March 20, 1922, the vessel was recommissioned under a new hull designation, CV-1, aircraft carrier number 1. She was named USS Langley, honoring Samuel Pierpont Langley, a former secretary of the Smithsonian who conducted early aeronautical experiments. Command was given to Kenneth Whiting. A passionate naval aviator, Whiting had spent years lobbying traditional battleship admirals to build a flat-deck carrier. Whiting understood that the Langley lacked the armor or speed to be a frontline warship. Instead, he operated the vessel as a floating laboratory, an experimental platform dedicated to inventing the tactics of carrier combat. By late 1922, off the coast of Virginia, a group of young aviators stepped into their aircraft to test the Navy's new hypothesis. They sat in fragile biplanes lined up on a wooden deck. Sitting in an open cockpit, looking down a narrow wooden runway suspended 50 feet above the ocean, there was no margin for error. A stalled engine or a missed arresting wire meant pitching straight into the sea. As those pilots throttled up their engines and rolled forward, they were testing the first mechanical systems and deck procedures for takeoff at sea. These early trials provided the operational data the U.S. Navy would use to build its future carrier fleet. October 17, 1922, off the coast of Cape Henry, Virginia, a 523-foot wooden deck pitches in the Atlantic swells. The ship turns her bow into the wind to force a headwind over the planks. At the stern, a Vault VE-7SF biplane sits trembling, its lightweight wooden frame shaking violently against the roar of the engine. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander Virgil C. Griffin receives the signal. He releases the brakes, accelerates down the narrow wooden runway, and lifts into the sky. With that sprint, Griffin completes the first official takeoff from an American aircraft carrier. Getting into the air was one challenge, but 9 days later, Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Chevalier approached the ship in an Aeromarine 39B biplane to attempt something far more difficult, returning to the deck. Chevalier lined up his approach with the narrow centerline of the deck and pulled back the throttle. As the wheels touched down, a tail hook driving behind the plane snagged primitive arresting wires, bringing the aircraft to a shuddering stop. These two flights proved the physical mechanics of a floating runway were possible. But operating a single biplane under controlled conditions was a long way from proving an aircraft carrier could function as an offensive weapon of war. A few weeks later, Commander Kenneth Whiting added the final mechanical milestone by letting a compressed air catapult hurl his plane off the forward bow. The basic physical proofs, takeoff, landing, and catapult launches, were complete. However, a massive operational problem remained. Launching and catching one aircraft at a time is an interesting science experiment, but it is too slow for a combat zone. To survive an actual naval battle, a carrier needs to coordinate dozens of aircraft in rapid succession. USS Langley was tasked with figuring out exactly how to do that. The ship transitioned into a living laboratory, given the mandate to invent the entire discipline of carrier doctrine from scratch. The crew of CV-1 had to figure out how to orchestrate fragile aircraft into a coordinated, lethal strike force. They had to prove that a carrier could provide its own offensive power, or it would remain a secondary scouting tool for the rest of the fleet. The first major crisis the crew faced was communication. Pilots making dangerous approaches to a pitching deck desperately needed real-time feedback on their altitude and speed, but primitive radios were useless over the deafening roar of a biplane engine. Commander Whiting solved this by creating the role of the landing signal officer. He placed a qualified pilot on the rear left corner of the deck, holding brightly colored paddles to visually guide incoming planes. Even with guidance, early landing gear frequently snapped or completely missed the arresting wires. When that happened, a 3,000-pound aircraft would plow at high speed straight into the other planes parked on the forward deck. To stop these catastrophic collisions, engineers developed the crash barrier system. They installed heavy, wire mesh barricades across the middle of the flight deck that could be instantly raised to safely catch out-of-control planes. With landing secured, the crew tackled a final logistical hurdle. Striking an enemy target requires getting a massive swarm of planes into the air immediately. Stowing every recovered aircraft down in the hangar below deck and bringing them up one by one took hours. Pilots and deck crews realized they could dramatically increase their sortie cycle rates by using a technique called deck spotting. Instead of moving planes below, they parked, launched, and recovered aircraft tightly together on the bow, leaving the stern completely clear for continuous landing operations. Through these precise innovations, visual landing signals, physical crash barriers, and high-density deck parking, the crew turned Langley's deck into a synchronized, rapid-strike machine. By 1924, Langley transferred to the Pacific Fleet to put these new procedures to the test in the Navy's annual large-scale war games, known as fleet problems. At the time, entrenched naval admirals fiercely defended the established doctrine of the sea. Massive battleships, armored in thick steel and bristling with heavy gun turrets, were the undisputed center of naval warfare. Carriers were viewed as a useful but ultimately harmless recon vessel. Looking at this schematic map of a fleet engagement, you can see the strict operational limit of that battleship doctrine. Even the largest naval guns of the era could only engage targets at a maximum distance of about 20 miles. During the war games, Langley's air squadrons demonstrated a completely new reality. As this strike radius expands outward from the carrier icon, you can see how her aircraft could launch surprise dawn attacks from distances of 150 miles away, striking from far beyond the horizon and completely outside the range of the battleship's defensive guns. The success of these simulated strikes convinced the Navy Department that air power was the future of naval engagement. These results immediately cleared the way for the construction of America's next generation of massive fleet carriers, the USS Saratoga and USS Lexington. The aviators on a slow wooden deck demonstrated that massive naval guns were no longer the only way to control the ocean. By the mid-1930s, the new tactics developed aboard the Langley led to the creation of much larger, faster fleet carriers. These massive ships could carry heavier payloads and travel at much greater speeds, leaving the aging Pioneer behind. In 1936, she sailed into the Mare Island Navy Yard for her final structural modification. Engineers removed her forward flight deck, reclassifying the vessel as a humble seaplane tender, designated AV-3. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Langley was stationed in the Philippines. As Imperial forces swept through Southeast Asia, the aging vessel was pressed into emergency service to transport Allied fighters to Indonesia. In late February 1942, loaded with 32 P-40 Warhawk fighters and 33 Army Air Corps pilots, Langley sailed as a slow, unescorted transport ship, racing desperately toward the port of Cilacap in Java. The visionary ship that had taught the U.S. Navy how to fly was now a slow, defenseless target, hunted in the very aerial warfare environment she had helped to create. On February 27th, approximately 75 miles south of Java, the inevitable happened. A formation of Japanese twin-engine land-based bombers spotted the vulnerable ship from high altitude. Despite throwing her rudder hard to maneuver aggressively, Langley could not escape. 5 high-explosive bombs tore through the vessel. The blasts ruptured her steel hull, flooded her main propulsion system, and set her aviation fuel tanks ablaze. Dead in the water, heavily listing, and burning uncontrollably, the order was given to abandon ship. To prevent America's Pioneer carrier from falling into enemy hands, escorting U.S. destroyers deliberately scuttled the burning hulk with shells and torpedoes. The hull of the USS Langley sank to the bottom of the Indian Ocean, where it remains today. But while the physical ship was destroyed, the ideas forged on her deck survived. Every modern nuclear supercarrier patrolling the oceans today operates on the blueprint written by her crew. From landing officer hand signals, to high-density deck spotting, to over-the-horizon strike tactics, they all trace their direct lineage back to the wooden planks of the Covered Wagon.